everyone, and welcome to our second monthly webinar, Start with the Truth, presented by Assange Defense and Stella Assange's campaign. I'm Eliana from Stella Assange's campaign, and I'll be moderating along with Nathan Fuller, Director of Assange Defense. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Just a little bit about what to expect today. Every month, we will be addressing a specific topic with a panel of experts. We will announce the topic on our social media channels so that you can leave your questions in the comments for them to answer after their speeches. Then finally, we will end each webinar with an action that we would like you to do. So friendly reminder to check the description below and also to follow all of our platforms. Please also give your comments and feedbacks into the live chat. Hope you like this panel. Nathan, take it away.
Thank you, Eliana. I am Nathan Fuller, Assange Defense Executive Director at AssangeDefense.org, and really appreciate you all joining us today, and really appreciate our panelists joining us. I'm just going to introduce them before we hear from each of them. So Hamit Dardagan is the co-founder, along with John Sloboda, of the NGO Iraq Body Count, where he is the lead analyst. From 2007, he was the consultant on civilian casualties in war for the UK think tank Oxford Research Group. He's written and co-written a number of analytical papers on casualties in Iraq after the 2003 invasion, including for the New England Journal of Medicine, PLoS Medicine, the Lancet, and the British Medical Journal. He undertook medical research for a number of organizations, including Greenpeace, and chaired Kalayaan, a human rights campaign for unauthorized overseas domestic workers in the UK. Matthew Hoh is the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network. Matt is a former Marine Corps captain, an Afghanistan State Department officer, a disabled Iraq War veteran, and a Senior Fellow Emeritus with the Center for International Policy. In 2009, Matt resigned his post with the State Department in Afghanistan over the escalation over the war by the United States. Ann Wright has been part of the peace community for 20 years and served as a member of the Code Pink Board of Directors. Before that, she was in the U.S. Army and the Army Reserves for 29 years and retired as a colonel. She was also a U.S. diplomat and served in U.S. embassies in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia, Afghanistan, and Mongolia. She resigned from the U.S. government in March 2003 in opposition to Bush's war on Iraq. She's an advisory board member for International Peace Bureau, World Beyond War, the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, and No to NATO. Thank you all for joining us.
This month's topic is debunking the Wikileaks harm smear, and we will start with Hamit. Please go ahead, Hamit.
So, thanks for having me. So I'll start with this misconception that Julian Assange didn't seek to redact names and protect civilians in his publications. I'll address that first in relation to the release in 2010 by Wikileaks of the massive trove of US military documents known as the Iraq War Logs. I'll then move on to the unique contribution of these logs to public knowledge and understanding, in particular on the extent and scale of Iraqi casualties. For those unfamiliar with our work, Iraq Body Count has been recording civilians killed in violence since the beginning of the US and UK-led military invasion and occupation of Iraq and its long drawn-out aftermath. We worked with Wikileaks and various media outlets to carefully analyze and responsibly publish the war logs, which laid bare hitherto unknown facts about the scale and impact of the war, as well as revealing war crimes that were committed during it. Julian Assange absolutely and determinedly sought to remove names from the Iraq war logs before releasing them. But finding a way to achieve this for 390,000 documents and then implement it over a matter of weeks or even months was no small problem, and ended up causing delays to the planned launch date. This caused much frustration among some media partners, who, however, could also offer no realistic solution themselves. Julian, however, remained resolute on this. There would be no publication without redaction. And like IBC, he was also committed to the bigger picture contained in the logs, not only the many individual and shocking revelations which WikiLeaks' media partners had discovered and rightly wanted to expose in their reporting. Their problem was actually much smaller, since they were only selecting slices out of the whole, those particular narratives that interested those media and which could easily be redacted by hand. IBC became closely involved in the redaction of the logs, as a whole. We didn't make a big public issue of this at the time, as both IBC and Wikileaks wanted to keep the focus on the many revelations in the logs, not on our necessary censorship of them. That censorship was algorithmic and had to be excessive to safeguard against the risk of names slipping through. Sure enough, I remember that there were immediate online complaints about the heavy-handedness of the redactions, but the process used was inevitably going to have that effect. Instead of the near impossible task of anticipating every possible Arabic name, our process found and replaced every bit of text that isn't in a beginner's English dictionary or is a potential identifier such as a profession, doctor, taxi driver, and so on, while allowing a few exceptions for common military or Iraq-related terminology. The idea was prompted by how spell checkers work, and the coding was carried out by IBC's programmer at the time, with the close attention of Julian himself. But that's all the side story. The important things, and rightly so, are as mentioned what the logs revealed, including of course about Iraqi casualties, IBC's topic area. Something that the horrors still unfolding today in Gaza have brought out is how important it is to record not just their statistics, but all possible details of the dead. Details such as their age, their gender, how they were killed, and whenever possible, their name. It is always difficult to convey the gravity and pain behind the numbers. Although we may speak of dozens killed in a particular incident or thousands over a span of time, it is of course individuals who die and are mourned. No society can consider itself civilized if it fails to give the dead the final dignity of recognition, not as a mass but as individuals. IBC's project is one that ultimately seeks to answer the only proper question when it comes to human lives, not just how many, but who was killed. To our surprise, the logs contained an unprecedented level of detail regarding individual Iraqi victims. We first noticed this when matching an entry in the logs to another previously reported case where bodies were found in a mass grave containing 28 civilian victims. While the logs list the same discovery, they also note that the families of the dead were able to identify the victims involved, and then the logs list all 28 names. Why this information, and much more like it, was kept classified and concealed from public view, I leave for others to guess. Now, having said all that, I will offer some statistics just to indicate the extent and scale of revelations on Iraqi casualties that are in Wikileaks' publication of the logs. This is best seen in the context of what was already known and what was unique to the logs. These findings are the results of years of work, still far from completed, by IBC analysts working on the logs, most notably Josh Doherty. Such analysis is possible because, unlike existing official US military releases of bare statistics and trend lines, of which there were already many, the details in the logs, including the when and where of individual incidents in which civilians were killed or found dead, allowed verifiable comparisons to be made with the data already held by IBC. At the time of their release, IBC had recorded about 91,000 civilians killed over the years covered by the logs from 2004 to 2009. Our figure now stands at close to 100,000 for the same period, almost entirely due to the content of the logs. We estimated back in 2010 that we would eventually be able to add 15,000 deaths to our civilian database, and that estimate still stands, pending continued analysis of the logs. The logs have also allowed much humanizing detail to be added to our database, with 6,000 of IBC's entries either entirely or partly based on the logs, and some 3,000 names which were found only in the logs. Now, to be sure, these are only a small proportion of all the deaths IBC has documented over the past 21 years, drawing from many tens of thousands of reports based on information from Iraqi medics, police and other officials, anonymously or officially provided, usually to local or international media. But the Iraq war logs are by far the largest single source on Iraqi casualties ever put into publication, and, as far as we are concerned, there is not now, and was not in 2010, any justification for this information being withheld from the public. As mentioned, there are so many logs that it has taken years for us to apply our careful scrutiny to each one, Just one indication of the magnitude of the information in these logs and the total impossibility of redacting them all by human editing. Even machine translation, or redaction, wasn't quick, and it's a testament to Julian that his determination to make them safe meant that a solution was found and the logs could be safely published. A healthy society should not need a Wikileaks, or for that matter, go to wars on false pretenses whose consequences are systematically recorded by militaries, but these records kept hidden until exposed by brave publishers. That the leading such publisher is kept in a high security cell without charge for years on end indicates the sorry state of our world today.
Thank you so much for that, Hamit. Would you like to go ahead, Matthew, with your speech?
Well, thank you for having me here with you today. Often when I speak about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, I bring up the first time I was asked to speak about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, because I think that gets to the point of why the American government has so ruthlessly pursued Julian and WikiLeaks for the past decade and a half now, as well as to the importance of what Julian and WikiLeaks have been trying to accomplish and what they have accomplished, as we just heard Hamit explain, the details, the understanding, the knowledge we have of what actually took place in Iraq because of Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, and WikiLeaks. But I was first asked to talk about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks on MSNBC, and this was in spring of 2010, right after Julian Assange and WikiLeaks had released the collateral murder video, which people are not familiar with. That's the gun camera video of the American helicopter in Baghdad massacring people in the streets, including a Reuters reporting crew and severely wounding children. And both myself and my counterpart, who was on the program with me, another veteran of the Iraq War, we were asked what we thought about this. And our response back to the host was, what did people think we've been doing over there all this time? So it was, for me, this revelation that the American people really don't know what's been occurring there. It's something that you understand conceptually, you see it around you, but it takes an experience like that to see the shock from people, the revulsion, the anger, the outrage, as well as the defensiveness that comes from a video like that being aired. So what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have done for so many people is they may have had a black and white picture, a black and white understanding of what's occurring in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in North Africa, throughout the world by the U.S. government. And this gives them color, though. This provides the details. This provides the affirmation. This provides very important context, right? And this allows people to have a true understanding of what the United States government has been doing and what it's been hiding from its own people. Certainly what you see violations of international law, violations of United States federal law, violations of natural law. And what it does is it gives us information as to what the U.S. government has known about, as well as what the United States government has been doing. So in terms of some of the revelations, some of what we learned from what WikiLeaks released, almost 15 years ago now, the understanding that is provided, so what has the American government known? Well, the American government knows that the biggest supporter of Al-Qaeda and other jihadist terrorist groups is Saudi Arabia. Right. So principal American ally, they're actually the biggest supporter of these terrorist groups. It's similarly vein, who's the biggest supporter of the Afghan Taliban? So at the time where the Afghan Taliban are killing young Americans in Afghanistan every day, and the United States' primary ally in the region is Pakistan, the WikiLeaks revelations are telling us that the Americans know that the Pakistanis are the biggest supporters of the Afghan Taliban, right? We also know that how corrupt the Afghan government was and that the American government knew it. So we see in releases from WikiLeaks that the Americans know that Afghan government officials are leaving the country with millions upon millions of dollars. Most famously, the Afghan vice president who showed up in Dubai with $52 million in his luggage. We know that because of WikiLeaks, and we know that the Americans knew that. We also know what the Americans are doing, what the American government is doing during that time period. Because of WikiLeaks, we know that the American government was secretly bombing Yemen. right? We know that the American government was spying on the United Nations. So spying on the diplomats, recording their conversations, reading their emails, but also capturing their private details, their credit card information, their fingerprints, to use for purposes that are nefarious, right? We know that that was whatever purposes they had in spying on the UN. It wasn't for the general public interest, right? So, I mean, these are the types of things that we know because of WikiLeaks, and we could do a whole webinar on just each of the various troves that WikiLeaks has released, right? So we could do a whole webinar on what did the Guantanamo Bay files tell us? What did the diplomatic cables that were released tell us? What did the Iraq war logs tell us? What did the Afghan war logs tell us? But also to, the scale and scope of American action abroad. And what was being kept from the American public. Again, things that violated international law, U.S. federal law, as well as just natural or moral law. So we know that the American government, through the FBI, was training Egyptian police that were committing torture, that were then turning around and torturing people. We know that the American government participated in the 2009 coup in Honduras. We know that the American government sabotaged climate change talks. We know that they helped plot pipeline attacks in Bolivia. And on and on and on. Again, we could do webinars, multiple webinars, just talking about what has WikiLeaks told us that the American government knew or what the American government did. And even things just that shows the general nature of the American government overseas. So my favorite of all the revelations is that in 2007, King Abdullah, the Saudi king at the time, he shook the American government down. He said, I want my plane, my personal plane, to have all the equipment, all the technology, all the luxury of the American Air Force One. And if you don't do that for me, I'm going to buy Airbus planes. And the Americans acquiesced, gave him our most sensitive, most advanced technology that we use to protect the President of the United States in order for the Saudi king to purchase Boeing planes rather than Airbus planes. And he bought like 40 of them too. So this wasn't a minor deal, right? But we know this because of WikiLeaks, right? We know what the American government knows, we know what the American government does, and we know its true nature, right? It's going to sell out its own highest secrets to the Saudis in order to make sure Boeing sells planes, right? So you get an idea of the actual nature of who this is. And then, of course, the larger things, as Hamit explained, one of the most important things about, say, the Iraq War was that the American government knew that the Iraqis that we were taking prisoner, that we were handing over to the Iraq military, to the Iraqi government, were going to be tortured, right? So it was like, we see that all of that wrapped up in just that one example. What did the American government know? Well, the Iraqi government's torturing. What did the American government do? Well, we gave our prisoners to the Iraqis, right? What's the true nature of the American government? It's to set forth events in motion like the invasion of Iraq that would just be immoral horror shows. So, to counter this, because this is so damning, right? This is such a dangerous thing for people to have this knowledge. The American government, of course, has gone after Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for a decade and a half now, essentially. And one of their chief points, one of their chief arguments against WikiLeaks and against Julian Assange is that they caused harm to American national security interests and that they directly harmed individuals, that people were killed because of Julian Assange's irresponsible release of this information. And we know that's simply not true. We know that's a lie by the American government. And why do we know that's a lie? It's because the American government itself has said so. So immediately following the release of the information by WikiLeaks, the United States government stands up a task force through the Pentagon. And it's led by an American general, a man named Robert Carr. And he assembles a team, dozens and dozens and dozens of people on this task force, not just from the Pentagon, but from across the entire U.S. government. There are 20 federal agencies involved in this task force, and their job for months and months, for years, is to go through every document WikiLeaks has released, every line, and chase it down and see if anyone was ever hurt because of it. And they never found anything. And we know this for two reasons. One, because they've said it themselves. In court, both in Chelsea Manning's trial as well as Julian's extradition hearings in Britain, the Americans have had to say, we have no evidence of anybody being harmed by these WikiLeaks releases. We cannot document a case of somebody being hurt by these releases. And the other way we know this is because a journalist named Jason Leopold did a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, and he got the documents from this task force. And the documents, so the internal documents from the US government looking at this. Did anyone get hurt by WikiLeaks? And those documents are clear as well. No one got hurt from WikiLeaks. Now, what the US government says, and what they still say, and we'll hear again in May when Julian goes back into the court, just as we heard again this past month and last month and over the years, was that, well, he might have caused harm. These releases may have done damage. Right? So he put at risk the lives of American forces, all speculative. But that gets back to the very real nature, the dangerous reality of what's going on here. This idea that the United States government can say whatever it wants in order to protect itself from the truth. So we take this idea that he may have caused harm. WikiLeaks might have done something that hurt someone, even though it never did. Well, that allows for the extrapolation to be presented across the board. So anything now becomes a danger. And as we in the US and throughout the West and throughout the world, I mean, I note today Russia just sentenced somebody, a member of Pussy Riot, to prison in absentia for posting social media posts, right? Because those social media posts were dangerous to the Russian Federation. It could cause harm to Russia for this musician to post something on Facebook or whatever was done, right? I mean, so governments around the world can use this justification to deny rights of speech, rights of a free press, as well as to censor. So even though we see that no harm was done by WikiLeaks in these releases, we were also confronted with the very real idea that governments, not just American governments, but other governments, will utilize just that threat, that speculative idea that harm may come to censor, to persecute, and to prosecute those who are speaking truth. I mean, on a personal level, just to wrap up, one of the reasons why I knew that no harm had never occurred was because of the very basic nature of the releases themselves. They were classified at the secret level. And I used classified information as a Marine Corps officer and as a State Department official. I used it both in Iraq and Afghanistan. I used it both at the Pentagon and the State Department. And anything classified at the secret level is classified at that level and not at the top secret level for that very reason. That secret level information, which is what WikiLeaks has always released, would not cause harm to either American interests, to American agencies or forces, or to individuals, just by its nature. That's why it's classified at that level. If it had the ability to cause that type of harm, it would be classified at the top secret level. But I mean, that gets back to the final point I want to make, is I go back so often whenever I talk about this, I think about this, I hear others talk about it, is what Neil Sheehan said about secrets and why government keeps secrets. And Neil Sheehan was the New York Times journalist who was very much involved in the Pentagon Papers case of 50 years ago, where Dan Ellsberg let the world know that the United States government knew that the Vietnam War was an unwinnable war, and they lied about it for years upon years. And in that case, Neil Sheehan walked away afterwards. And he said, what I learned, what the Pentagon Papers has taught me about secrets, is that the American government, or governments in general, keep secrets, not to keep their populations, not to keep their people safe from foreign dangers, but governments keep secrets to keep themselves, the governments, safe from their people. So I want to thank you for this. I really appreciate being a part of the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate your remarks, and want to turn things now to retired Colonel Ann Wright. What do you make of this discrepancy between the incredible revelations about what WikiLeaks released and this narrative the government is trying to sell about alleged harm?
It goes along with what the U.S. government does all the time, which is lying. And I say that after, as you mentioned, being in the U.S. military 29 years, both as a active duty and then in the reserves, and then 16 years as a U.S. diplomat. And I think Matt and I both would agree that our country shades the truth, to put it mildly, all the time. And the revelations of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange on all of these places that both Hamid and Matt have listed, from the Afghan war logs, and I helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, in December of 2001, and was there for about 6 months, and then left for what became my last assignment in the State Department. I was the deputy ambassador in Mongolia, and then I resigned there in March of 2003 in opposition to the war on Iraq. And to see the Afghan war logs and then the Iraq war logs about what was going on behind the scenes was not surprising, because we know what goes on in wars. And the surprising part was that all of a sudden this became public. Not that the military wanted it public and the State Department didn't want it public, but because of this crazy institution called WikiLeaks. And I can remember in the very beginning thinking, oh my God, this is wild. I mean, look at all of this stuff that's coming out. In the very beginning, as a former U.S. government employee, was like, oh man, this is really going to be something. And then as the newspaper started actually publishing parts of it and reading it, and it was like, oh my God, didn't we learn our lesson? Hell no, we don't learn the lesson of Vietnam, where the same things that were going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, that went on in Vietnam, the same atrocities were going on. And yet it took WikiLeaks, to bring these out to the public in a short amount of time. It didn't take years, as it did in Vietnam, for us as the public to really find out what had gone on there. I remember with a group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPS. I actually was not an intel analyst or anything like that for either the military or the State Department, but because I'd worked so long with the government, I was given honorary status in this intelligence group of professionals who are now retired. And we've made several trips to London to have dinner with Julian in the Ecuadorian embassy. One time was to give him an award from this organization, and another time was to give an award to another whistleblower in the UK. So having dinner with him in that embassy and, talking about in general terms, because we anticipated that the embassy was recording things on its own for its own use. Now we know the CIA had co-opted the Ecuadorian embassy to record Julian and for years. But to be able to just sit back and talk about the importance of what had happened with WikiLeaks was so important for us, and I hope it was important for him too, to know that people around the world, of course, in the very early days were solidly behind him for the reasons that Hamid and Matt have identified, because we really didn't know the full extent of the duplicity and the evilness and the criminality that parts of our government were conducting. And if you want to just see using what's going on in today's world, we have another collateral murder that actually we've got to see in real time, and that's in Gaza. There are 3 vehicles were attacked by the Israeli military with drones firing into these 3 vehicles that the Israeli military knew exactly who they were because they had gotten permission to go on this road. And the drone pilots could certainly see the name of World Food Kitchen on the top of the vehicles. So we actually don't need WikiLeaks now to disclose that, because the media has disclosed it. We still need WikiLeaks, though, for a variety of other things that are going on in Gaza today. I mean, I hope somewhere some investigative groups are able to find the Israeli documents that show the horrible, horrible, evil, genocidal decision-making that the Israeli government has made. And I hope they are held accountable for their criminal acts, whereas U.S. government politicians have never been held accountable for any of the things that they've done in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria. You talk about the need for more information to be known about what is going on in our world today. And groups like WikiLeaks are critical to getting us the information, to the solid information that shows that the U.S. was definitely a part of the coup in Ukraine and the lead up to, in my opinion, entice the Russians to go ahead and attack Ukraine because the U.S. and other Western countries kept pushing Ukraine to join NATO. I mean, there's a whole raft of information that's out there that slowly comes out, but it would sure be nice to have the WikiLeaks with us right now. And then you look at other places in the world where it's so important, as Julian and WikiLeaks found us the information for Afghanistan and Iraq and for Guantanamo. If you look behind the scenes, what has been going on in the Trump administration, where, the outreach, what I thought was about the only positive thing I can say about the Trump administration was reaching out to North Korea and the decision-making behind the actual meeting 3 times with Kim Jong-un, and then all of a sudden, nothing. And the behind the scenes of what went on with that are going to be so enlightening. The behind the scenes of the continued U.S. informal war on Iran, the undeclared war on China. Well, I wouldn't say it's undeclared, but, the proxy war the U.S. has with Russia. All of these things and the behind the scenes, the information about the political decision-making of the United States and why it has pursued its policies. And particularly, I think from the latter days of the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration, there's a lot of secret wheeling and dealing that has been going on that we, the public, need to know. We can make some guesses on some things, but it certainly would be nice to have those messages that WikiLeaks was able to publish. Not that WikiLeaks itself was the one that went after those documents. I mean, they are not the ones that hacked into anything. It's that they provide a platform for people who have been in the government that are offended and horrified by the actions of the government, and they blow the whistle on the U.S. government and on other governments, like through the Panama Files and things like that. Julian, as a publisher, as a journalist, is receiving the worst possible treatment in the world for an honest journalist profession. So it is so important that we support him, that we look at the people that have suffered also, not only Julian, but Chelsea Manning, who went to jail for being a whistleblower, for Daniel Hale that went to jail for being a whistleblower. And they're both out of prison, and Julian still is sitting there as a professional journalist. So I thank everyone for the opportunity to encourage everyone, do what you can to put pressure on our governments to say that there should be no extradition of Julian Assange from the UK to the US, and that he should be immediately released from this imprisonment of decade, wrongful imprisonment for what he has done for the benefit of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any responses to any of the speeches before we move on to the question?
I'll make one response to Matt's commentary about the classification of all of these cables that, to an ordinary person, that there were cables that were classified as secret and then they were given out. Well, if you've ever been in the U.S. government, you know that if you ever want any of your reporting read by anyone, it's got to be secret. If it's confidential, no one will ever look at it. So everything is put at a secret level, and 99% of it should not be at a secret level. That's my comment. Thank you.
Right. When you're a young officer and the first time you get to read secret information, it's so disappointing. It's basically like, I could get this information from the encyclopedia, or I could get this information from Google. Yeah, it really is, as Ann said, it's a level of classification that most of the time contains information that is already public knowledge.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. First, related to what was just said. I mean, this also means that there's like a huge number of people who actually read these reports. I mean, I believe it wasn't just people in government, but also contractors and so on who had access to the logs. So, I mean, what's so precious about these secrets that they're being seen by so many people anyway before Chelsea Manning, amongst them whom was Chelsea Manning? It's obviously they're not really that important to be kept secret. It's just the public, that's the general public and the media, I guess, who are not supposed to see them and respond, accordingly. And another thought arises in relation to this, which is that, by revealing what really goes on and the kind of discussions that people are really having that goes more, I think, to Cablegate and so on, one would hope that there would be a hunger for people to just say, well, why is this stuff kept secret anyway? Why all these high-level meetings and discussions and decision-making? Why don't we see what's being decided? Why are there not more simple open meetings which the public can access or recorded and then transmitted? Okay, we have discussions in parliaments and in the House of Representatives and so on. But what about all these committee meetings and so on that are not made public and where the real decisions seem to be made? Why are they kept secret at all? It's supposed to be a democracy we're living in. We want to know what information is being used to make decisions and so on, and who's arguing for what, whether it's different from their public stance, so they wouldn't be able to have a different stance from their public stance, for example. So these releases expose just how banal and how routine a lot of these discussions really are, that we're not privy to anyway.
Right. Hamit, and that brings up the key aspect of this is the role of the American and Western media overall, right? So when I relayed the story about being on television, being asked about the collateral murder video and, my shock and being upset that what did Americans think we were doing over there? Well, that was in 2010. So we have been to war. We have been an occupying power in both Afghanistan and Iraq for the better part of a decade, conducting these types of operations, killing people. And the American people were not knowledgeable about it. See, they weren't aware. It wasn't, and that's because what was chosen to be presented to them by the American media. And now at that point, though, if you had turned to an Iraqi or you turned to someone throughout, say, the greater Middle East and showed them that video, they would have, obviously expressed dismay at what they were seeing, but at the same time, too, saying, what's new? I've seen this before. We see this on our channels all the time. At that point, YouTube was just developing as a force, right? But if you're on Arab language versions of it, you could see these types of videos coming out of Iraq and then, Afghanistan as well. And, I think that's something for people now, I think particularly younger people who may not have the recollection of, say, 15 years ago, of what 2007 was like when that video occurred. The American government can make the pretense at that time that they mistook a Reuters television crew for being, carrying a weapon, because at that time, cameras required two hands to carry, right? Now, I think for a lot of us, being able to witness, what Ann was talking about, that great horror, the genocide in Gaza, and we see it every day on our screen. We see stuff that we never want to ever see again, and then tomorrow we see it again. That really wasn't available 15 years ago. We didn't have, people didn't have the cell phones with a high definition video camera in them. So what was able to be kept from the American people was, one, a role of classification, but also, two, a very real intent and complicity by the American media to serve the interests of the American government, of the American media, by only or by very limited ways telling the story of what was actually happening there.
Yeah. One of our complaints about the media treatment of Iraqi casualties was not that they weren't being reported, it's that they were being reported in the back pages, in media wire reports and so on, that, media could either publish or not republish and so on. So it took a whole research operation like Iraq Body Count with dozens of people looking at hundreds of sources to pull all that obscure information together. So we were very aware of what was being reported out of Iraq. But your ordinary news consumer who might just be going to one news website a day or something like that, in those days especially, they just have no idea what's going on. Unless there was a massive bombing or something like that, it wouldn't get any prominence. All the sort of daily 2-3 people being killed in their car here at a checkpoint there, by an IED somewhere else, that kind of stuff just was reported because we have thousands. I think in our database, something like 2/3 of all the reports, if not more, are of incidents where just 1 to 3 people were killed. So these are many, many small incidents that were reported in this. I think we have 60,000 separate incident reports, but very difficult to find. it took like research, a whole research project to extract all that.
Well, I mean, I can tell you, I remember exactly where I was when I was in Iraq on a State Department team, and it was around February of 05, March of 05. I remember exactly where I was when I read the email, or was told, maybe someone else was reading the email, but I was standing in the G5 section of the 42nd Infantry Division up in Tikrit, Iraq, and that we were being required to report civilian casualties. So almost 2 years went by before the U.S. military instructed its subordinate forces to record and report civilian casualties. I mean, it was done beforehand, but it wasn't deliberate. It wasn't an order to do so, right? So only if the civilian casualty information filled a role in your report did you report it. But as you said, Hamit, if it was just one person killed or 2 or 3 people killed, particularly if we're the ones who killed them, best to leave that out, or it doesn't really matter. Those numbers don't count. And when you put that together, though, when you add them all up, as you all were doing and have been doing, and thank God for your organization. I mean that so much. The role, what you have done in terms of giving names and voices to those that were murdered. But yeah, I mean, I remember that we went 2 years without that being a requirement for the U.S. military to actually record civilian deaths.
And if you look at what's going on right now in Gaza, I mean, in 6 months, 33,000 people have been killed, and the Israeli military with U.S. weaponry has just run over, demolished the evidence of it, although back in the files, there will be the evidence as who is guiding those drones, who was flying those jets, who was in the tanks that were firing the artillery shells on every day. And I sure hope that someday that we have a Gaza body count to help the people of Gaza determine who killed their loved ones and what was done with them. Because it's truly a genocide. And when you look at the figures that happened in Iraq, where Hamid was saying now you've confirmed over 100,000 dead. I mean, that's a genocide that took over a longer period of time. But thank you all for doing that those family members now know what happened to their family. And I certainly hope in Gaza that someday that we are able to help the Palestinians in Gaza trace what happened and then hold accountable those that did it.
You quoted me correctly, Anne. I did say 100,000, but that was just for the period from 2004 to 2009 that is covered in the Iraq war logs, and a good 8,000 or 9,000 of those actually came out of the logs. Now we are over 200,000 for civilian deaths, and we think about 300,000 if you include combatants. In Gaza, we also have the Israeli military saying that, I don't know what their latest version is, but it's like, are they now saying 6,000 or is it 12,000? They come up with all these lovely rounded numbers that are not based on any kind of research or work, or being Hamas. How would they know? I mean, in our work in Iraq Body Count, we don't sort of kind of try to reach into people's minds and find out if they lie, if they're liars or not liars. In fact, some of the information we have could only have come from the US military, even before the war logs. So, for example, sometimes the US military would run over children. A convoy would run over a child trying to sell cigarettes or something, and they would be the only source for that death. So, I mean, we couldn't just kind of go, oh, the Pentagon always lies, we're going to ignore that information. The information was only coming out of the Pentagon, and sometimes they would actually say what they'd done and apologize and so on in some incidents. But what we always look at is, what's your political position, but what's your physical position in relation to the facts that you're putting out? And obviously, the IDF's physical position in relation to what's happening on the ground in the places they bomb is like they're nowhere near it. So their claims about how many of the dead are Hamas and so on are just not to be taken seriously. It's just part of propaganda, basically. That's what that is, pure and simple.
And Hamit, you reminded me of something that the WikiLeaks revelations also taught people, is that we use a term called MAM, military-aged male, which is what the Israelis are doing now, right? Where anyone of fighting age or of working age, if you don't have that type of military background, so any man of working age, essentially, so 14 or 15 years old up until you're in your 60s, is classified as a military-aged male. And so that meant anyone we killed who was in that age range, any adult male, even teenagers, would be classified as combatants or terrorists or however we wanted to describe them. And I'll say that in my experience, 3 times to war, I'm very ashamed of this. But I would say for every one civilian casualty incident that was reported that might have made the Western press, so to speak, certainly reported on in the Middle Eastern press or in Arabic or Muslim or Central and South Asian press, but in Western press, for every one incident that was reported as civilian casualties, there are probably about 4 others that were not reported. You know, I was a part of some. I remember one of our helicopters killed 9 people, wiped out better part of 2 families, basically, including a bunch of kids. And, no mention of that. I've gone a number of times looking to see if I could find that. And then, of course, smaller, less grand events, they're certainly not going to catch the attention, as you were saying. So without WikiLeaks showing us this, right, without revealing this information, all we had to go on was whether or not the United States military was going to admit it, which, as we said, sometimes they do, most of the time they don't, and often in a very biased manner, such as any of the men we kill are considered combatants, but then also to the American media, which was terrible at actually reporting what was occurring there.
That's why it's also really important to take seriously and to, thank goodness they're there, because although there's a lot of this stuff coming out of Gaza that people capture on their smartphones and so on, the sort of collation of information and the bigger picture of the information only comes out of the Gaza Health Ministry, actually, and the Palestinian officials are the only people who are actually keeping track in any kind of a more comprehensive way of what's going on. And, as we all know as well, those institutions have been horribly degraded also. So, that infrastructure has been steadily degraded for the last several months already. So the chances of getting good information out of Gaza about the level of casualties and so on is evaporating very quickly.
Yeah, Hamit, as you mentioned, the purposeful targeting of specific infrastructure to destroy the records of a society, an element of genocide that's going on. And even though the U.S. military is trained that you're not supposed to be doing things like that, you're not supposed to destroy cultural places, you're not supposed to destroy churches and all this. And supposedly Israel being the most moral army in the Middle East, I think is what the U.S. calls it anyway. I mean, it's just outrageous what is going on. And for the ability to track what all of this is while it happens, it's quite a feat to try to keep track, as the beleaguered Ministry of Health is doing in Gaza. And the same thing, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Russia, whether or not any of the behind the scenes data that is not really made public, and neither one of them, neither the Ukrainians or Russians, want to admit how many people have been killed. So it will only be later that maybe somewhere some whistleblower will offer up some records that the world can use to more accurately determine what has gone on in yet one more terrible war.
I don't know if you'd agree with this, Matt, but from your experience in Iraq, especially, as bad as civilian recording was, the reporting and recording of combatants is we find much more difficult to handle. It's either exaggerated or discounted, or civilians are marked as combatants. Those are the issues we face, but I suspect also that you saw that as well.
Certainly when it comes to airstrikes, the drones are even worse about this, how obscure and how false and how disjointed the reporting can be, and some of it is from, what's called the fog of war. Some of it's just from the uncertainty of the way these things occur. You drop a bomb from however many thousands of feet, you don't know who you killed, let alone a missile launched from 100 miles away or whatever it is. But then there's also institutional pressures that exist within the U.S. military, institutional pressures like in any other organization. So if you are, say, a drone squadron commander, or say you're a special operations commander or battalion commander, infantry battalion commander, and how you're evaluated is in the number of kills you have, right? The number of targets you take out. And if you know that your predecessor, say, had 100 kills, had killed 100 people, right? Then, well, of course, to be better than your predecessor, you have to kill 120 or 125, right? So there's those institutional pressures as well. And when you take that over the span of the war in Iraq, the span of the war of Afghanistan, you can step back from that and say, my God, how many people were being killed just due to the institutional pressure of do more, of kick down doors, raid places, shoot people, launch more Hellfire missiles from my drones than my predecessor did, as well as any other reason you can find. So there's that pressure as well. But certainly the inability to accurately say how many people were killed in airstrikes or drone strikes, then of course you're going to classify all the military-aged males as combatants, gives you a very, very false picture. But then again, I'll go and harp back on the American media because they went along with it. So particularly saying the drone campaigns in the Obama administration, you had American officials saying routinely the American drones were not killing civilians. Saying that with such certainty and being repeated as if it was fact, as if it was truth. And then, of course, people like the director of Central Intelligence, John Brennan, who said that all the time, he becomes a commentator on CNN and continues to say such things. And then you have a whistleblower like Daniel Hale come out of the drone program and release the drone papers. And of course, what those drone papers shows is that was not the case at all. It matches up with what people on the ground were reporting, people who are under attack were reporting, people who had any knowledge were saying, like, that's just not possible. There's no way we're not killing civilians, But what Daniel Hale reports, of course, is that we are killing thousands and thousands and thousands upon civilians. In order to kill one high-value target, as we call it, an HVT, we have to kill 25 or 30 civilians in order to do so. That in certain campaigns, drone campaigns, 90% of the people we killed were civilians, right? I mean, so just the whole scale, the scale of the lies that went into it. So you have the pressure to say that you're doing more, right? You have just the natural fog of the war, the uncertainty situation, but then you have that how it becomes even more unclear and even more of a tool for the narrative of war, the propaganda, is the desire for both the American government and the American media to minimize any knowledge of civilian deaths, of civilian casualties. And that even includes not reporting on some of the most egregious things the U.S. government has done. So we're looking at what happened with the What World Central Kitchen and the deliberate targeting of the aid workers. And the American government did that as well with its drone program. It did double tap strikes. And what it would do was it would strike a target, oftentimes killing many civilians. There's a lot of reporting in some of the independent press about how the United States Israelis have a metric where they feel for a low-level Hamas commander, it's justified to kill up to 20 civilians. The United States had these same metrics when going after targets in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Syria and Yemen, et cetera, and Somalia, that we could justify killing certain amounts of civilians because of the target we're going after. But then what happened was, so you had that, of course, but then what happened would it be a second strike. So when first responders would show up, when people would show up at the site of the attack, they would then be attacked, as well as the fact that the Americans, we were attacking funerals. Justification was, well, of course, this terrorist buddies are going to be at the funeral, so we'll hit the funeral. I mean, so these absolutely gross war crimes being conducted by the American government over a period of years, over a number of countries, and having no value, right? I mean, as we were doing these drone strikes, you just saw Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State grow in capacity and strength. So not only was it immoral, it was also illegal, and it was counterproductive. And of course, the American media largely stayed silent on it.
And a tactic no better than the terrorists, because terrorists also adopted that same double tap tactic as well in some of their attacks. Same thing.
One of the first Iraqis that I worked with in 2004 was killed in that manner. He was killed by a suicide bomber, and a suicide bomber struck his funeral. And I remember at that point, so repulsed by that. But within a matter of time, I realized we were doing the same thing.
Same thing, with high-tech weapons. That's the difference.
High-tech weapons, as well as cover and support from American and Western media as well.
Yeah, that's right. The apologists for it.
Indeed, it was. We've made trips to both to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, to Yemen, to talk with families of people that have been killed by U.S. drones and to hear their stories and how, as Matt identified, many times the people that came to help those that had been injured or killed in the very first attack, that they were killed too. And the atrocity of all of this and the ability of, a group like WikiLeaks to keep searching or finding, keep putting out that, if people know about these things, to let them know so that they can publicize them, has been so important for our better understanding of how nefarious and criminal our actions have been by the United States in so many countries in the last centuries.
Just to say, we had some questions from the audience, but you guys have really covered a whole lot of the things that we want to talk about. Your collective experience makes for such an interesting kind of analysis of where we've, what has changed and what hasn't. You guys were all around 2007 when some of these actions happened, 2010 when they were released, and now you're still paying close attention when the publisher of these is still being persecuted. So just to finally bring this conversation back to Julian, how do you guys think that we can kind of flip the script and change this US narrative that he's put people at harm's way and get people to understand that this is in the public interest to know this kind of thing, that we deserve to know this and that we're a better informed public and democracy when we do know this kind of thing?
Well, if I could start out, I think, your webinar series here where we talk about Julian Assange is very important. And I would suggest that we have a webinar that has portions that will speak directly to the Afghan war logs, the Afghan whatever, because the real activists now in the world are the junior folks of our country. And when we see the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, when we've seen Black Lives Matter, the young people that will carry this forward were not even alive, probably. Well, certainly when the events were taking place, and most of them don't quite remember what happened to Julian. So I think having some of these that we can put segments up. Did you know that this is what happened? We were out in front of the White House last week with a sign, Julian Assange, and it's spring break in Washington. So there were tons of people, and you could see the people walking by and the younger folks going, "What's Julian Assange? Why are they out here?" And so we would motion them over and try to talk to them and give them a little brochure. But the younger people of our country don't really have the background knowledge to know how important WikiLeaks has been and how unjust Julian's imprisonment is.
Well, I'd say this whole notion, you started talking about how we need to debunk this idea that Julian's releases caused harm. In fact, not only is there zero evidence that they've caused harm, as Matt was telling us earlier, what he exposed was a huge amount of harm. He showed harm. He showed people who had been harmed. So that's where what we need to flip. That's the opposite of what's being put out. The more we focus on that, what he's been revealing is genuine harms, real harms to people that have happened, people who've been killed, injured, tortured, and in other ways hurt by the very same powers that want to or still do imprison him. And Daniel Hale, who Matt mentioned earlier, more or less in the same kind of context, is what I think might help with this. Certainly, they were not just releases of information for information's sake. This was important stuff, realities that people had actually lived through and experienced and come to harm it.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have some more questions from our supporters. And one of them, I will address Matthew with this, is about Aaron Bushnell. In your statement on Eisenhower Media Network regarding the self-immolation of Aaron Bushnell on the 25th of February, you spoke about the moral injury that Aaron endured by being part of the military and called the act a statement of non-complicity. Can you speak to the consequences of Julian's case for military personnel in terms of their awareness of what they are complicit in? I think the questions that we're getting is just more like, with our knowledge of what the US does and is doing, how much of this, what would you say to military personnel in light of the revelations, and how do they keep on going?
After it's been 4 years since COVID, you'd think I'd remember to turn the mute off, right? I think you see a split between those who are active duty military and those who are veterans, those folks who have come out of the military. When you're in the military, it's really hard because you're in the bubble. And maybe it's different now because of the way alternative media is, independent media is, the way social media functions. But certainly my generation, being in that bubble, you really weren't confronted with dissident voices, or you were able to rationalize it in this, say that those were past mistakes. Those were errors of a previous generation. So you're able to be in Iraq and have a full understanding of what the United States did in Central America in the 80s, full understanding of the U.S. War in Vietnam, full understanding of, say, the American occupation of the Philippines 100 years before. But then be able to tell yourself, because you're in this bubble, that those were past mistakes, that the continuous line of history doesn't stretch through this moment. But then when you get out and you're out of that bubble, and you're no longer part of the mission, and you've given yourself the luxury or the permission to think about these things, you find a lot of veterans coming to the conclusions that we were, put simply, in the wrong. And you could see this in public opinion polling of Iraq and Afghan veterans. American Iraq and Afghan veterans finds that more Iraq and Afghan veterans view the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as not worth fighting, or as a mistake, or they're opposed, than the American public at large, and the general public, right? So certainly this understanding of what they took part in, what was done there, what it accomplished. So what you have now, I think, is you have this ability for service members, people who are on active duty, to see what's occurring and have a connection on a larger scale. Whereas before, it was easier to deny that you were a part of all this. And so you saw what happened with Aaron Bushnell, where he self-immolated as an act of resistance, as a demonstration of not being complicit. I think he's inspired others. I know Ann could talk about this very well. Ann's been working with a young Air Force member, active duty Air Force, a young man named Larry Aber, who is on a hunger strike in front of the White House right now. I think he's on day 5 or so of the hunger strike. And Ann has been working with him, and I know Ann could talk about that. But I think what it is if you come to that realization, then you have to act on it, because recognize it opens the door for the moral injury to take a role in your life, to have a factor in your life that will be devastating. If you try and push it away, if you try and keep it behind a locked door, it's going to take control. Anyone who's familiar with mental or emotional or spiritual health issues know you try and wrestle something, you try and hide something away, it only makes things worse. So I would say to people who are being confronted with this, you have to recognize it, you have to accept it, and then you have to find ways to remove yourself from that complicity. And some people call that atonement, some people call that repentance, some people call that doing good. But you have to find out for your own mental, emotional, and spiritual health's sake once you realize you are complicit. And I would say to everyone else, we have an opportunity, because of this type of technology, because of this independent and alternative media, that Julian and WikiLeaks didn't have in 2010. We have an ability now to reach and talk to people and educate people, inform people, organize people, mobilize people that didn't exist 5 years ago, right? Let alone 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And with that, we can reach more people and make people understand what's occurring, what the American government is doing, and how they're complicit, and then importantly, how they can no longer be complicit.
Matt, can I ask you, where are places that people who are struggling with this and are sort of starting out on that kind of about face, if you like, from their existence, their current existence, who they can go to? Are there associations? Are there veterans associations that are, I'm sure there are, but I'd like to hear about them.
Right. Yeah. And thanks, Hamit. That's really helpful to ask that, because certainly, so both Ann and I are members of Veterans for Peace, as well as another organization called About Face, Veterans Against the War. They were formerly known as Iraq Veterans Against the War. And there are a number of organizations that can also help. If you are on active duty, you can call the GI Rights Hotline, or you can call the Center for Conscience and War. Both those organizations, just Google those organizations, and their counselors are absolutely fantastic. They know this information. They know your rights as a service member. better than anybody, and they can advise you on a host of things you can do, including pursuing conscientious objector status. And again, if you're out, I would, recommend people look up Veterans for Peace or About Face, and you'll find some folks who are not just people who you can be in solidarity with, but you can act in solidarity with. I'll throw another thing towards Ann's way. Ann is leading the Gaza flotilla. So in a couple weeks' time, a flotilla will be leaving to Gaza to break the siege of Gaza, to do something about the genocide, about the deliberate starvation that we're witnessing. Ann and others will be on those ships attempting to break the blockade. So within Veterans for Peace or About Face, you can find other veterans who not just agree with you, not just men and women that you can be around, but men and women you can act with.
Fantastic.
And I'll just follow up with Matt. Yes, Aaron Bushnell's example has really resonated around the world. I mean, the numbers of people that have held vigils in their countries for this young man that took his own life for the people of Gaza. And Larry Aber, who is an active duty Air Force person living in Spain, working in Spain, arrived 2.5 weeks ago in Washington, walked in with us we met him. He had found the houses of Congress and came to where we meet for our every single day, going into Congress and trying to change the minds of most of the people of Congress. And so here was this young man, and we said, well, why are you here? He said, I couldn't stay at home. I couldn't stay in Spain. So I took annual leave to come here because I have to do something. And so he walked around the halls with us for 2 weeks. And then he said, I've got to do something more than that. And he decided he would go on a hunger strike. And that hunger strike has resonated more than any of us have ever seen really any other hunger strikes. He has already had probably 50 interviews with New York Times, NPR, Democracy Now! The Pentagon, of course, is getting in touch with him too about what he's doing. But so far, they haven't slammed him. He's also filing for conscientious objector status. Because he has realized that why he joined the military is not playing out in the way that he thought it would, that he now recognizes the brutality of the U.S. military. And at his base in Spain, they are loading munitions that are going to Israel. So he said, I will not be a part of that. So it's, and I'll go on to one other question that I think that we've had was, Code Pink Women for Peace and others that have been in the U.S. Congress for the last 5 months, every single day going to the offices of these Congress people who continue to say that here it is 6 months later that every bombing is a part of the self-defense of Israel. Every bombing in Gaza, every person killed is about the self-defense of the state of Israel. And the U.S. government being so complicit by continuing to send weapons to them, and this pitiful, pitiful statement that they make that there have been no incidents that the State Department has been able to find that violate the laws of the United States or international law in the use of these weapons. So that's one of the reasons that probably 40 or 50 Americans will be on this flotilla to challenge the Israeli blockade of Gaza, because we're so tired of the lies that our Congress and our administrations are making. And we feel it's important for unarmed civilians with great training in nonviolence confront the Israeli military. They will have guns. They have killed people on these flotillas before. We recognize the dangers, but it is important that the citizens of the world go back at all of our governments about their complicity in allowing another genocide in the world to continue.
Thank you, everyone, for watching this webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. We are doing this every month, and Anne gave us some suggestions for some future topics. But if you guys have suggestions too, please leave them in the comments. And remember to read the description and follow our socials. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone, to our panelists. Thank you for joining and speaking up for Julian. Yes. If you would like to have any closing remarks, Hamid, if you would like to start and say goodbye, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's been really enlightening, really great to speak with people with such rich experience and knowledge and such a humane approach to these desperate issues that continue. Been there all our lifetimes and are going to continue after our lifetimes, I suspect. But that's how we struggle. We have to just, do what our consciences compel us to do.
Well, and that's so right that our consciences compel us to say that Julian Assange must be freed. And we will continue to work hard in all of our areas to, particularly in the United States, to keep going to the White House, to go to the Justice Department, to have conferences and rallies to say what he's been put under for the last decade has been horrible, and the United States should drop the charges against Julian and withdraw the request for extradition immediately.
And I'd just like to, of course, thank you for this. And, what an honor it is to be here with all you all who are doing the work you do. And for those who are watching, thank you. And thank you for supporting Julian. And please support those who are supporting Julian. So please support Assange Defense. What they are doing is incredibly costly. It's incredibly resource intense. But their defense of Julian just doesn't have the aspect, which is certainly important enough, of freeing a man who they're trying to keep in prison for doing journalism. It's got implications for us all. And so those of us here in the U.S. who believe in having a First Amendment, please support Assange Defense, because their successful defense of Julian really has implications for all of us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining
Thanks
us.
again.
Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you all.
Thank you, everyone, for watching our second ever webinar. It's every month, so remember to tune in next month. Right now, I have a very special guest. Some of you may recognize her from our live stream where she came to London to be a presenter for us for DayX. Jody Sard from Assange Campaign and Adelaide for Assange. Welcome, and thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
So at the end of every webinar, what we do is we discuss like an action that we want people to do at home. So you're here because you have an amazing program with Assange Campaign, which is the Meet Your MP campaign. And so this action is for Australians. But we'd love Jody to explain this program for you Australians out there. And then people who aren't Australians, we have another action that we'd like to introduce after. So stay tuned for that. So go ahead, Jody. Can you tell us a bit about Meet Your MPs, how it started, how successful it's been, which is actually very successful, and also what people need to do to sign on?
Absolutely, my pleasure. So Jody from Adelaide for Assange and the coordinator for the Assange campaign, Meet Your MP here in Australia. I am so pleased to say that we started February last year, so 2023 we launched, and we have over 3,000 Australians that have already signed up to meet their MP here in Australia. It's been doing so incredibly well. We have had over 70 meetings with MPs across Australia, and every little action counts. So going to see your MP, so basically you sign up. It's a really easy process. You get a step-by-step guide, which has templates, lets you know who your MP is, ideas and how to engage your MP, how to do follow-up phone calls. And of course, you have a wonderful coordinator. That's me. I'm always here to help you every step of the way. We sometimes need a little bit of resilience, a little bit of persistence to get to see these MPs. But in my experience, since the beginning of last year, I have found that the MPs are a lot more accessible, a lot more media around Julian has allowed these MPs to feel that they have more time to see their constituents, or they have more knowledge about what's happening for Julian. And not only that, they're more concerned about this Australian citizen, and that's what the most important thing is. And we need to capitalize on that, because it is the people that are going to save Julian Assange. And the Meet Your MP program allows you to go and speak directly to your MP so they can give your message to the Parliament, and that is that 9 out of 10 Australians want Julian Assange free, and we need to press the government to be more robust in their advocacy for Julian Assange, and more publicly robust in their advocacy for Julian Assange to get him home. So we need more people to sign up for Meet Your MP, because politicians care about numbers, and if we've got the numbers, then they need to listen to us. So if you've been thinking about it, you don't go by yourself either. You go with a small group of people. We connect you with other people in your constituency. What's been great about this is people have made friendships over this. You know, they've been in the same constituency, they go to these meetings, they meet like-minded people, and it's just been a wonderful experience for not only the MPs, but also for the people that have joined up to meet the MPs. So from my perspective, I'd love to have you join us. We need you, Julian needs you, and democracy needs you. So free speech, free press, free Julian Assange, and please come and join us at Meet Your MP program for Assange. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jody. I just love this program, and I am thinking, or we are thinking really, of whether or not we can replicate it for the US. So any of you guys watching, please tell us what you think in the comments about that. We're going to explore whether or not we can replicate and have a program like that for the US. Now, on to our next thing that we want to introduce. We're introducing it. It's like a soft launch. For May 3rd, which is World Press Freedom Day, we want to do a program that you actually came up with, Jody. This is like your idea and we're running with it. So like, do you want to explain it a little bit, like what it is? And I'll add on.
So we did this in Australia. We did a Speak Up for Assange, which was based it was for when Anthony Albanese was going to the US. So we had put it out to politicians actually, so a lot of MPs, and we've asked them to speak up for Assange, which was to do a short video, upload that onto their socials, and then of course the Assange campaign shared that and used that. It was a really successful campaign that we had here in Australia. I think we had 35 MPs in Australia actually speak up for Assange, and you can find that on the Assange campaign. We've still got those for Speak Up for Assange. So yeah, I think making that more broader for the community as well, making lots of noise, because the more noise we make and the more people that the government knows are speaking up for Assange, the more chances we have of freeing Julian Assange. And I think it's a really wonderful program. I think it's got legs.
Yes, and so do we. So that's why we're sort of suggesting something a little bit simplified. We want everyone to do it. So basically, we'll have some sample scripts on a web page. We're going to put that link down below in this description. We will be promoting it more on our socials, so don't worry if you're like confused right now. We will hopefully make it simpler, but essentially it's very simple. 15 seconds, maybe even less, 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 10 seconds, whatever, speaking up for Assange on World Press Freedom Day. You can do a video, and then you just tag our campaigns. That's basically what you do. But the main thing is that we want everyone to be doing it on May 3rd, because people will be thinking of press freedom and they may be bringing up different journalists, but we want Julian to be at the forefront of that. So that is the idea behind it. Now, if you're shy, I'm a little shy and kind of awkward, as you might have noticed in these spiels. We're going to actually come up with a graphic that you can put on your social. So it would just be like, I'm speaking up for Julian Assange on May 3rd, Press Freedom Day. So we're going to actually provide those for you as well, and you can download it from our websites. Yeah, so don't worry, you can be part of it. You can be part of history, even if you're shy.
I think it's a wonderful idea, and I agree completely. Speak Up for Assange is a very powerful tool. And I know that there's so many, like we were talking before, we know that there's so many Assange supporters. You wear your t-shirt out in public and people come and talk to me all the time. And I know Ileana and I were just having this discussion before, you know, you wear the t-shirt, you wear the merch, people are always talking. So Speak Up for Assange is for everybody. Yes. And like you said, you don't have to be a professional, you know, speaker on public forums. You just be heartfelt. Say to the camera, this is how I feel. You know, there's no right or wrong words. Just say something, 15 seconds, upload it onto your socials. I think it's a wonderful idea.
Great. Thank you so much, Jody. Thank you everyone for watching our webinars and doing all the work that you've been doing, sharing, you know, like Jody said, every action counts. So just sharing, liking posts, you know, going out on the streets if you can, just all these initiatives, some of them incredibly creative, and we appreciate all of them. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thanks.
See you next time.